Good morning. So nice to see you all. So nice to be together this morning. My name's Justin, one of the pastors here, and really, really glad to be together. So, when I was in the third grade, I started at a new school about halfway through the school year. So I started out, born here in Mineola, Jackson Avenue Elementary School. Anybody? No? All right. Jackson Avenue Elementary School, was there through like halfway through third grade, and then we moved to New Jersey, right? See my face like disdain for New Jersey, but we moved to New Jersey, central New Jersey, and I remember the very day that I started at my new school in third grade. It was February 3rd. Why do I remember that? It's because February 3rd is also my birthday. So I start a new school in the middle of the year on my birthday, don't know anybody, and somehow it comes up, and I think I tell my teacher, and I tell the other kids that it's my birthday, and my teacher doesn't believe me. She thinks that I'm just like the new kid trying to get attention or something. And to her credit, she did go and check, I think, the records and then like tried to make it up to me the next day. I don't know, does she get credit for that? Because I'm still talking about it like 40 years later. So, but I do remember this one kid who believed me. And he looked over at me and he said, "Happy birthday." And I remembered him because I saw him at the bus stop that morning. And it turns out he was my neighbor. And we became just like the best of friends for years and years and years. Like, we were the kind of friends who just always had each other's back. We would play together every single day on our block, playing stickball all summer. He had all the good toys, so I'd go and play his like Sega Genesis and if you know, you know, and all that kind of stuff. It was like the greatest thing ever. He was always that friend that I could always go back to. And when I think back on that time, we lost touch. I don't know where he is or what he's up to, but when I think back on him and I remember him, what it was like to have a friend who was always there, who was reliable, who was home base, someone I could always go back to. So like 9 years after that, I head to college, University of Maryland. Anyone? Also no. Oh, yes. Okay. All right. So I go to University of Maryland. I grew up in sort of a really very conservative, what felt like very restrictive to me environment. So when I go into college, big college, fun, party school, I'm thinking to myself, it is time to let loose and have some fun at this big, fun school. And, I was walking with Jesus a little bit up to then, but not closely. And thinking to myself, well, now it's college, right? Now I'm off, can do whatever I want, whenever I want to. And I get there, and I make some friends that are no good for me. And there's this one guy, his name's Brian, and he was from what was then called Campus Crusade for Christ. Now it's called Cru. And this guy would just not stop pursuing me. It was as if God was like grabbing me by the shirt and was like, "No, come back this way." And I was like 18-year-old punk kid. Like, I kept standing him up. Like, we'd make these appointments, and then I just wouldn't show up. And he'd be like, yeah, don't worry about it, man. Let's try again. How about Thursday? And he just would not give up on me. And he just kept pulling me back and speaking what is true into my life. And he introduced me to some friends who do follow Jesus. And some of them were seniors, and they're like 22 years old, and they're so cool. And they would just pour into me and speak life about who God actually says that I am. And it was as I think back on Brian, and I think back on those friends in that season of my life, I think of them with gratitude, and I think of them with fondness. And in some ways, I feel like I owe my life to them. And in the last couple of years, every January, I head over to Nashville to meet up with 5 guys. We turn our devices off for an entire weekend, and we have committed to one another this sacred trust of carrying each other's stories, in the hopes that as we do share our hurt and our pain and our hardship and every nuance of our stories with one another, and we carry them for each other, that God would redeem them and cause us to tell better stories for the sake of our kids and their kids and their kids after them. We call ourselves the eulogists. We didn't come up with that. We call ourselves the eulogists because we're hoping that there will be such depth of love and vulnerability between us that we can eulogize each other one day. At least whoever lasts the longest, which is definitely not going to be me. Some of those guys are in peak physical condition. So, When I think of them with so much thankfulness and camaraderie and hope, actually. Hope for the future. I'd love for us to just do something together, if you would. If you wouldn't mind maybe like closing your eyes, or maybe just like pick a spot kind of down on the floor in front of you if you want to keep your eyes open. And I'd love for us to just think of someone in your life who is near to you, has been influential upon you in your life. Maybe someone you've known for a long time, maybe a family member or a dear friend. Just bring that person to mind for a moment. And as you think of them, what are you grateful for about them? And how do you carry them with you in big and small ways? And what is it that you want for them? Okay, you can open your eyes. Just bookmark that for a minute. Bookmark that person for a minute. We are beginning this new series through Paul's letter to the Philippians. And a lot of what we have just been thinking about makes its way, it's woven into this letter that Paul writes. It's helpful for us to get a little bit of background about the book of Philippians, because Paul's letter to the Philippians, though it was written for us, it was not written to us. Who was it written to? The Philippians, right? Okay, that was like the easiest question you're going to get today. It was a letter written to the Philippians. So who wrote it? Paul. Many of you guys know this. Paul's this really educated, influential Jewish leader. He's a former persecutor of Christians, and then he himself encounters Jesus Christ, and his life is changed forever. And then he becomes one of the greatest church planters and evangelists in history. And he's writing to this letter to this group of people in Philippi. Philippi is this Roman colony in ancient Macedonia. It's where a lot of retired politicians and retired military leaders would go after they had done in their service. So because of that, within Philippi is this real sense of nationalism, Roman nationalism. They're really proud of the fact that they are considered like this mini Rome. And as you can imagine, when Paul goes to Philippi and starts announcing that there is a king, King Jesus, and that king is someone other than Caesar, that actually doesn't go so well, right? You've got this group of people who are struggling with that tension. So those who come to Christ in Philippi, they're suffering, their futures are uncertain because of their resistance to saying that Caesar is like the ultimate king, and then recognizing King Jesus instead. So Paul plants this church in Philippi, one of the first churches he plants right around 50 AD. You can read about it in Acts chapter 16, actually. And then he writes this letter to them 10, 12 years later. It's 60, 62 or so AD. It's 10 or 12 years after he plants this church. Paul had been through a lot in 12 years. He'd been imprisoned, he'd suffered a lot, he'd planted a lot of churches, and the people in Philippi had been through a lot in 12 years. They've experienced a lot of persecution and hardship, and Paul writes this letter to them. And in that writing, in this letter, there's this great richness to what it is that Paul's trying to communicate across this letter. And it rings of this theme of how we're invited and empowered to participate in the life of Christ in everything we do. We're invited to participate in the life of Christ in everything we do. So what does that really even mean? Invited to participate in the life of Christ? Well, I think we have to kind of get a sense of the larger backdrop to really be able to understand it. The backdrop that actually begins way at the beginning of our Bibles. Right? So you have to know that larger story that God creates a good world and he invites humans to partner with him in the cultivation of that world. He creates humans to live in a way that's marked by generosity and compassion and love for one another, and it's all good. And you know how it goes. Humans reject that invitation of God to partner with him, and we mess everything up. And generosity is replaced by greed, and compassion is replaced by selfish ambition. And everything that's wrong with the world today is rooted in that, yeah? But God refuses to give up on this human experiment. And he steps into that broken human story by sending his son Jesus, who comes onto the scene and lives the life that God intended for humans to live. The life that he intended for you and the life that he intended for me is lived out by Jesus. Jesus' life marked by that, not marked by self-advancement, but instead it's marked by commitment to living for the good of another. Right? It's his life that's marked by the generosity and the compassion and the love that we were all created for. So Jesus' life then shows us this new way of being human, a new way of relating to one another, a way that's not marked by self-advancement, but by love for others. And then as the ultimate act of sacrifice, he takes upon himself the weight of humanity's failures, and he dies a horrible death on a cross, and he rises again as the very first renewed human, and he offers that renewal to everyone who puts their faith in Jesus, and he fills them with the Spirit and empowers us to do more of the things that he has done and live out the life we were intended to. So, in light of all of that, he invites us to participate in the life of Christ as Jesus lives out his life through us. So he pleads with people. Jesus pleads with people through us. And Jesus reveals himself to people through us. And Jesus renews his world, how? Through us. And it's this full and beautiful life that we tend to kind of cherry pick from and miss out on the whole thing. And so in Philippians, Paul is beckoning people back toward this fuller experience with the life of Jesus. So how does he do it? He talks about so many different things that we're going to unpack in these coming weeks. He talks about his own view of suffering. Paul talks about how to die would be a gain. To die and be with Jesus would be a gain. But in fact, to stay and work and sacrifice himself for the benefit of others is actually better. So he's going to do that. He walks us through what it means to follow Jesus' example in the face of suffering. He shares this beautiful, famous poem in chapter 2 about what it means that Jesus' service and sacrifice ultimately brought about flourishing. And he invites us into a life that does the same. And he thinks back to the power and the status that he gave up for the benefit of others and the benefit of the gospel for this better life. And because of all of this, it's like this is not just like some new way of living. It's actually the existence that we were made for. And it's what Paul's trying to communicate as we spur one another on toward that. Listen, if you're new to Beacon or even new to this whole following Jesus thing or just kind of figuring that out and finding your way, we're glad you're so glad you're here. This is a little community of people who have been made new by Jesus and are learning how to live and relate to one another in a new way. And we hope that you sense that and that you feel valued and that you feel loved here, because you are. And if you've been a part of this family for a while, well, this is more than, hey, I go to church with Nelvin and Sheba, or with Crisbell, or with Robert or Justin. Though it is that. There is incredible opportunity and responsibility to one another that Paul touches on in such powerful ways. We don't just read about what it is that God is doing through us and then try to experience it. We actually bear the presence of Jesus to one another. We bear the presence and the life of Jesus to one another, which is how we participate in the life of Jesus together. But all of that is rooted. All of the amazing things that Paul is going to talk about in this letter that we're going to unpack in coming weeks, it is all rooted in this. It is rooted in looking at the people around us and allowing for the Spirit of God to help us see and feel and experience God's love for us through them. And that they would feel and see and experience God's love for them through me, through us. So I'd love to do something together. Introverts, don't worry. I'm not going to make you talk to anyone or anything. I'm one of you. If you would, take a look around the room. Turn your head, turn your neck. Look at the people next to you. Maybe a smile. Look at the people behind you. Look at the people in front of you. Right? Take a good look. Take those faces in for a minute. So some of you look around at these faces and you feel so full. Your heart is full. You're like, oh man, I love these people. And then some of you look around and you're like, all right, they're okay, I guess, right? I mean, I don't know them all that well. I take them or leave them. Some of you caught eyes with someone who's like, man, that guy's really annoying. No, you're all looking at me now. What does that mean? Paul is about to encourage the Philippians toward the life they were meant for. But before he does that, he thinks of them and he feels something for them. The same way we just looked at one another's faces and feelings come up. He feels something for them as kind of the foundation of everything else. And I actually wonder how God might be asking us to let him cultivate these feelings in us for one another and what it is that he might do through that. So Paul, as he's writing to the Philippians, he seems to feel these three things. He feels gratitude, he feels connection, and he feels desire. He feels gratitude, something that he is receiving from them that just bubbles something up inside of him. He feels connection, something that he feels with them, and he feels desire, something that he wants for them. And he starts out this letter, before getting into all of this amazingly good stuff that he is going to cover in this letter, he starts with this underlying sense of how he sees the people around him. So we're going to start with this, with gratitude. What it is that Paul seems to be receiving from them and how it is impacting him. He felt something as a result of what he was getting from them. Gratitude. Philippians chapter 1, verse 3 says this: I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy. So as Paul starts to think about these folks that he's writing to, that he's known for a long time, he planted this church like a decade earlier, and as he starts to think of them, it brings about a feeling within him, this feeling of joy, and that feeling pivots him toward God. He didn't say, when I think of you, I remember you, I start to feel all warm and fuzzy inside, though he probably does. He says, I remember you and I thank my God, because something about what it is that he is receiving from them points him, pivots him toward God. Because something about the way that they love him and the way that they have cared for him somehow reminds him of the way that he is loved and he is cared for by God himself. They bear the presence of Jesus to him, and they point him to God. And it's so much of what it is that we do for one another as this new kind of community, living this new kind of way, that every face that you looked at when you turned around and looked to your right and to your left is an image bearer of God himself and points us toward a God who loves you and values you more than you could possibly imagine. He remembers them always with joy because of their partnership with him, their partnership in the gospel. He feels partnership. That's this famous word in the Greek, koinonia. It was like this big thing back in like the 80s and 90s. It was like printed on t-shirts. It was a whole thing. Partnership, fellowship is often how it's translated. And it's not less than this idea of partnership or fellowship. We think of fellowship, it's like hanging out at a barbecue. Yeah, let's have some fellowship. That's all good stuff. It's not less than that. But it is more. It is the fullness of a shared life with one another, right? Paul has been, when he's writing this, he's been under arrest for like 2 years. He's been on house arrest, isolated, completely by himself. And part of the reason that he writes this letter is because the Philippian church sends this guy, Epaphroditus, over to him with supplies and with just a good, warm, encouraging word from the Philippians. And he receives Epaphroditus, and he receives these supplies, and his heart is full. And in the midst of feeling alone and feeling isolated, and surely wondering like why all of this is happening to him, why he's decided to give his life to Christ, and he's finding himself in jail over and over again, in the midst of that, he feels seen, and he feels loved, and he feels valued. And what he receives from them points him toward God once again. He experiences God's love and God's provision for him through their love and their provision over him. From the first day until now, he's got this sense of like the longevity of God's love for him. He's got this sense that God is the one who finishes what he started, right? Look at what he says. I'm sure of this, he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. And he's encouraging them with that very word that God is faithful. He's the one who sees it all the way through. He finishes what he started. And it's like, you read this and it's like warm and fuzzy. You feel like, oh man, he loves this group of Philippians. So their relationship must be warm and fuzzy all the time. But that's actually not the case at all. Remember I told you, like, he was there spreading the good news about King Jesus in a place where any king other than Caesar is going to be rejected. So he's met with a lot of resistance, even from people who follow Jesus. So here he finds himself in a place where it is not always easy, and there was a lot of disagreement. And yet, he's willing to see them for their partnership with him in the gospel, for their closeness and their nearness to him. Their relationships were not perfect. They were not the same. They did not always agree. And yet there was this oneness that he was willing to lean into. So not only does Paul feel this profound sense of gratitude for what he experiences from them, but he also experiences something because he takes this community with him everywhere he goes. He feels this sense of connection with them. Take a look at what he says. It's right for me to feel this way about you, because I hold you in my heart. You are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. It is right for me to feel this way about you, to feel this sense of gratitude. Why? Because he holds them close to his heart. He feels all this gratitude. He feels all that he has received from them, the love, the acceptance, the provision. It points him towards God, and he carries that close to his heart everywhere he goes. He is suffering, but the Philippians have given him this sense of withness. And in that, he feels a little less alone, right? He knows that they are partners with him in his suffering. And in that witness, he's reminded of God's withness alongside him. As he thinks about these friends in Philippi, he's reminded that God too is with him. He knows that they have joined him in that suffering. It's not just that he's holding them near to him. He also knows that they are holding him near to them, to their hearts. That they suffer with him. They feel compassion to suffer, come with compassion. They suffer with him. This is the power of living our lives for the benefit of one another. I suffer with you, and you suffer with me, and we voyage together through this life that is marked with suffering into God's renewed world where suffering is no more. Journeying with one another, with one another's grief and suffering, it's far more than just like helping push someone up a hill, if you've heard that metaphor before. Though there's beauty to that sentiment. There's beauty to that sentiment where it's like I'm suffering, I'm having a hard time getting up this hill, and you are kind of pushing me along. That is rich, that is beautiful. But to share in one another's suffering the way that he's describing, it's not just helping me up that hill. It is taking upon ourselves the suffering and the burden of others and taking some of that load off and walking up that hill together. Jesus modeled that time and time again, right? Like every time before Jesus would heal someone, he would see this woman who had been bleeding for like over a decade, and he would look at her and he felt something for her. The scriptures say he felt compassion for her. He suffered with her, and then he would heal her. He would see a person who's been lame or blind for their whole lives, and he would feel something for them. He would suffer with them, and then he would heal them. Right before Lazarus, when he finds out that Lazarus has died, and he knows Lazarus is going to rise again, yet his family members are weeping. Jesus weeps. Why does he weep? He knows that Lazarus is going to live again, and yet he suffered with the people who were suffering, with these family members who were weeping. And that suffering with happened because he got close to them. What does it mean for us to get close to one another in that way? Tim Keller famously said, you cannot help with a burden unless you come close to burdened people. Getting close to suffering is difficult, but it reveals God's presence, and we bear his presence to one another in that witness. So for God is my witness of how I yearn for you with the affection of Christ Jesus, that born out of that connection was this desire to be with them. So out of gratitude for what he enjoys from them and out of connection with what he feels with them is born this desire. He wants something for them, and he expresses that the only way that he knows how, and that's by praying for them. Let's take a look. Whoops, let's go back here. Yes, we're going to get to that. That's good stuff. Look at what he says here in his desire for them. He says, "It is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God." So remember how Paul was talking about earlier, how we seem to have some awareness of like the longevity of God's faithfulness, right? He who began a good work in you is going to see it through, right? You've been with me from day one until now. He had this sense of the longevity of God's faithfulness, right? Well, he believes that so deeply. He believes that not just for himself. He believes it for someone else. He believes it for the people in Philippi. And as we sit here and we want to believe that God has been faithful in our lives through the timeline of our lives, what does it mean then for us to believe that for somebody else? As we looked around at these faces, to believe that for the people sitting next to us, in front of us, and behind us. And he prays for where he knows God is going on their behalf. He prays for their best. He wants it for them. He prays for them that their love may abound more and more. So that idea of your love may abound is this idea of like something that just like overflows and boils over the top. So I love Indian masala chaya, right? In Malayalam, my parents' native language, we call it chaya. Right? Sometimes here we call it chai. Some of you go to Starbucks and order chai tea, but you've just said tea twice. You've just said, I would like a tea, which is weird because we don't say, I want lemonade. That would be weird. So please, if you say chai tea, just leave one of them behind. Go with chai. All right, so I love chai. And this is what it looks like when we're making it. We put it in the pot, milk, some water, some cardamom, some various herbs you can put in there depending on the flavor that you want. And I love making it. I love sipping on it on a nice Sunday afternoon. So I'll make it just like this. And you put all that stuff in, then you turn the stove on. And every time I do it, so begins a showdown between me and that pot. And I will just stare at it because I will not let that thing boil over. And I watch it, and they say a watched pot never boils. That is 100% true. So my kids will distract me for a second, and I'll be like, oh yeah, no. And I'm like, I run back, I'm like, no, got to keep watching the pot. And I'm talking about 100% of the time. I'm staring at the pot, and then I just start daydreaming. And then the pot boils over, of course. Every single time it looks like this, like 100% of the time. But this is actually the concept